everybody. Welcome to another episode of What a Hell of a Way to Die. And the boys are back in town. We have Adrian Bonenberger on with us to discuss Ukraine, a thing that once upon a time Nate and I didn't think was that big of a deal, but suddenly it is, as it turns out. Adrian, how are you doing?
I'm part of me is wishing I'm still in Ukraine. Part of me is happy that I'm here in a pretty peaceful place.
I can understand that, considering all three of us have prior experience to being in a place where people shoot at us.
So you recently, if I remember correctly, Adrian, you posted that you went to Kiev to help get your in-laws out to Lviv and then further on out of the country. Is that correct?
Yeah, that's right. So my and part of this was part of, I think, that experience for me was informed by what happened in Afghanistan. In the summer of last year. One of my interpreters was over there, and I was sort of corresponding with him, as I think many folks, probably yourself included, Nate, were doing with various people that they knew who were still in the country. And he had a family, and he was really just, a pretty, reasonable and decent guy. And I was encouraging him to get out, and he couldn't get to the airport. He couldn't get across any border. And when the government fell, he was murdered. Not clear if he was murdered by Taliban or just sort of, a group that didn't like him or some sort of personal thing. But as a result of that, I had that at the front of my mind. We were just begging my in-laws to get out of Kyiv when it looked like, there was a possibility that Russia was going to invade.
Yeah.
So once the invasion kicked, we were pretty much, I think we had tickets to Poland, then like 3 or 4 days after that, and we were going into the country to get them out.
So talk us through how you got to Kyiv from Poland.
So we went to Lviv. We didn't go to Kyiv at that time. So we arrived in Ukraine in I think it was like March 2nd or March 3rd.
Mm-hmm.
And it was one of those things where the situation was very fluid. Like there were a lot of just sort of random checkpoints. It wasn't clear if Belarus was going to come into the conflict to shut down the border with Poland. And Kyiv was like under attack.
Yeah.
So what we did was we went to Lviv and tried to find a driver to get them out. They'd left the city after the 3rd or 4th day. The electricity was knocked out. They were on the 14th floor of an apartment building. And so they went to a suburb with some friends. And it took us a few days to find someone who would drive them. And then they got driven from Kyiv to Lviv. And it took about 2 days. They actually posted up in an abandoned school and spent the night there because curfew, you can't be on the road at night. And then they linked up with us and we were hanging out for about a week before we left again. Yeah.
So what was your experience like? I mean, I will fully admit that I didn't want to go on record and say I think one thing or another will happen. But when I woke up on the 24th and Russia had invaded, I was just more stunned than anything else because it seemed like such a, but why would you do that kind of thing? Like if the goal was to extract concessions via a threat, then you've basically now cashed in your sort of big chip, if you will. And when I saw it happen, I saw very quickly, signs of both the scope of it, like trying to do an airfield seizure in Hostomel, completely overwhelming Donbass. I thought this is incredible. This is unreal. I can't believe this is happening. So there was a part of me that was wondering, what your experience was like, because part of me was like envisioning nonstop shelling, violence, war of movement, but then also that Lviv was perhaps a not safe, but safer versus the east of the country. And so I'm wondering like what your experience was like. I mean, you described already going through checkpoints, having a military curfew, stuff like that. What was it like being there, having to move through this and move in the direction that everyone's wanting to not move in?
Lviv was totally like, from a military perspective, it was safe. The inconveniences to us were curfew, the checkpoints, a persistent sense of needing to maintain, OPSEC about what we were doing. I was there with 2 other sort of veteran writers, and we were training citizens. So I knew we were going to be over there for a while. We had a couple weeks. I didn't know how long it was going to take to find a driver to get my in-laws out of Kyiv. So we found, my wife and I found things to do. My wife did sort of humanitarian assistance, receiving stuff from Poland, pushing it, medical supplies mostly, pushing it eastward to Kyiv, Kharkiv, and then southward to Odessa and Mykolaiv. And then myself, Matt Gallagher, and Ben Bush trained civilians who it was sort of like a local city defense force. So in the event of Lviv being invaded, they would have been stood up as a unit, or they will be stood up. Who knows what will happen still. And annexed to the territorial defense forces. So I talked a couple times with the territorial defense forces general, but he was sort of like, we were an economy of force effort for an economy of force effort for an economy of force effort. The only times, like there were air raids, probably like 2/3 of the day, of the days that we were there. And the only time that I felt threatened at all, like personally, was there had been a lot of reports of like the International Brigade, the Foreign Legion, whatever, dudes training in Yavoriv, which is a base, 20 some odd, 10, 20 miles outside of Lviv. And that got rocketed pretty heavily, or missiled, I think near the end of our stay there. But I wasn't there. We weren't training there. We weren't training military dudes. We were training civilians. We were training in an abandoned factory. So I know I didn't. It was mostly a fear that like people would like Russian saboteurs or whatever would figure out what we were doing and like do some type of like blue on blue or green on green shooting or green on blue shooting, something like that.
I'm curious, Adrian, how did you was the training part of your plan to go to Ukraine, or was it we got to get there, get the in-laws out because I know what can happen in these situations? What got you? Okay, so we're here. Might as well go ahead and start training some civilians. Like how was that a plan, and how do you make that leap? Like who do you talk to start doing that training?
Yeah, So once we resolved to go over there, I think we bought our tickets on like a Thursday and we were flying out on a Saturday or something. We both, because we were going to be there for a couple weeks, we knew that we figured that would be enough time to get my in-laws out. But we knew that we were going to have a fair bit of time too. And we weren't just going to be like, on the phone with, trying to find a driver. Like that was going to sort itself out pretty quickly, one way or another. Excuse me. Because of that, I wanted to do something that wasn't fighting. I actually talked to a couple lawyer buddies of mine and a couple buddies of mine that were officers with me who are now with the FBI. And I was like, guys, like what's going to get me in hot water over there? Like, what can I do to help out? And they were like, well, to begin with, you shouldn't join the Ukrainian military. And I was like, okay,
yeah, definitely don't do that
for 2 weeks. So no problem. I got that. They were like, okay, so the second thing that might be a problem for you going over there and then coming back would be training military units. And I was like, okay, well, that's something I would think about doing, helping train the military. That seems sensible to me. They were like, yeah, kind of a gray zone there. And I was like, okay, well, what about, training citizens, like some kind of citizen militia? And they're like, so long as they're not extremists, so long as they're not like a group that's affiliated with some type of extremist political philosophy. If it's just citizens, if it's a group of people coming together to train, like, yeah, that's like the least gray of the gray areas possible. And so Ukraine is very similar to Afghanistan or other, parts eastward of the West. I think in the West, we think about contracts. It's like, I've signed a piece of paper and that means I'm going to do a thing for you or with you. And in eastward, it's more like, I know you, or you're a friend of a friend, or you're a friend of the family. Therefore, I trust you and we can do something together. And so it was a friend of a friend who was doing stuff with the territorial defense forces who put me and Matt and Ben basically in a room. We basically had to pitch ourselves. And there were 3 different groups that were listening to us. It was a group from Lviv, a group from Ivano-Frankivsk, and then there was a representative who was tied to Khmelnytsky, which is a town sort of between Kyiv and Lviv. And we decided to go with the Lviv people for a number of reasons, chiefly because we were in Lviv and it was easiest and we could start the next day.
It's very simple. You just say that you're helping train the Ukrainian airsoft team to bring home the gold in the airsoft competition that I assume happens somewhere.
Did it feel very strange, Adrian, to be like, we're here to build, Ukrainian territorial defense force capacity? considering that's basically swap out the acronym, and that's sort of what our mission was in Afghanistan, notionally.
It felt weird, and I definitely saw that corollary. The difference for me was that I'm a civilian now. I'm a citizen, and they were civilians. And so I was trying to explain this to a friend of mine recently who was like, is training Afghans like training Ukrainians? And I was like, I was training Afghan military and Afghan police, mostly Afghan police, and most of the training we were doing on my 2 deployments was patrolling with them. It wasn't like running them through, marksmanship ranges or anything. But this was like a mashup of part of like Marine basic infantry training, because Ben Bush was a Marine and he knew a lot about that stuff. And the first couple of weeks of Ranger school, small unit tactics, team level tactics, squad level tactics. And, another cool thing about it to me was, you guys know my politics, that I'm sort of, I consider myself on the left. I'm a believer in, community sourced ways of organizing politics and other such things that are centered on individuals. And I think a big part of what went wrong. This is I don't know. I guess this could get me in hot water in certain circles. There's a big disagreement about this on the left. In the USSR was like it was insufficiently sourced from communities, and a lot of it was top down. And I understand, like I'm not an expert here, but sort of like the promise of what I understand as like a community that works together is a community that is as unhierarchical as possible. And one of the cool things about the U.S. military is you're working 2 levels up, you're working 2 levels down. So there were these people, the wealthier people that we were training were gravitating toward the leadership positions. And we were like, no, like everybody gets a rep, like where everybody gets to be team leader, everybody gets to be squad leader. Like you guys all need to understand this regardless of what you do. And I feel like that's part of the guts of understanding how a democracy is supposed to work, is that like whoever's the leader is the leader, but there's a kind of like consensus that drives that. It's not how much money you have in your pocket. That's how it's supposed to work. We know that's not actually how it works in America, but that's how it's supposed to work.
I'm interested in...
At least it works. It used to work that way. You used to be able to buy your commissions, and I mean, you still can. It just requires also a 4-year degree in America. Though I am curious, because I know that there's one of the big conversations about the failures of the Russian military, especially during this time, is the lack of an NCO corps. And speaking as the enlisted person on this show, is your small unit tactics, small squad tactics, and everything. Is that basically you're kind of like, look, we need to train sergeants that can deal with these people here, this group, that group, as you said, the person here is in charge of these 2 city blocks because he's the person that we trained to do it. Is that kind of what you're shooting for? Is kind of a loose civilian NCO corps that can, in if necessary, if called up, can then function like kind of slot in as military group if necessary. Like that's what it sounds like to me. And as the NCO, of course, I want everybody to talk about how great NCOs are. So,
we didn't conceptualize it. We weren't thinking about it in those terms. We were all officers when we were in. But I think you're right. There is a kind of, I think the NCO Corps, I'm not sure. You tell me, is the NCO Corps more meritocratic than the officer corps? I mean, I don't know. If you think it is, then yes, absolutely. Like what we were going for was training an NCO-led unit. I mean, it wasn't about like you're the officer, you're the person who gets to make, who gets to lead. It was like, look, you're the person who has this responsibility. This responsibility is, a building or a room or a block.
Well, is that, I guess that responsibility is given to them because they've shown that they can do that responsibility, or is it just, hey, you're in charge kind of situation?
It was a combination. So there were, Ben insisted that women be part of the training. And at first the Ukrainians did not, they pushed back a little bit on that. And he was like, we're not going to train you if women aren't a part of the training. And one of the best natural, as you guys both know, like the greatest intellectual leap in the military in terms of leadership is when you go from maneuvering individuals, either as like, a team leader or yourself, like moving yourself around, having a sense of how you can move, to moving units and assigning tactical tasks to units. And some people get it and some people kind of don't. Some people like cap out at team leader. Some people cap out at soldier. But other people like have a great instinct for saying like, okay, well, this is kind of a team task. This is a squad task. If you can understand that, then you can understand this is a platoon task. This is a company task. It's like, that's the same. I think that's like the same part of the brain working. And the two of the best leaders in the group, out of the entire group, were women. They just happened to be the ones that were sort of like, this is, I get this. Yeah, the team, this is a team task. This is a squad task. And, are they going to be, leaders in the Ukrainian military? I don't know. Like, it's possible that they won't, because there is still, it's a pretty patriarchal society over there. But just exposing the people in training to that idea feels like some type of progress to me. It's like, well, they were good at it, so that's why they did it. You didn't do it because you weren't good at it, and they did it because they were good at it.
Well, Adrian, if you're going to use the United States military, you need to time all of them on how fast they run a 2 mile.
The sole metric for success.
Exactly. How many push-ups can they do based on their age? But if they're overweight, they got to go. You got to flag.
Adrian, I've got to ask, were you ever at a point where you thought to yourself, I'm very close to enemy lines, if you will? Because I feel as though that is not really a thing that we encountered in Afghanistan very often. There was sort of notional control, and there were areas that were more sympathetic or unsympathetic to insurgents. But like, I suppose in the early days of the Iraq War, there was friendly and enemy lines. But otherwise, like, we weren't really in a war of movement like this. And I was wondering, like, what that felt like to be that close to a situation where there's like, there was sort of the forward line of control, like actually seeing that in the flesh. And I don't know if you had that experience or not, or if even just the fact that it was a real thing that was, say, 10 miles or 50 miles or 100 miles away was enough to sort of like hammer that feeling home.
So the last time I had that feeling was the last time I was when I lived in Ukraine, because there were lines of control. It was the sort of demilitarized zone between per the Minsk agreement, and so you'd go to the line of contact, and like you'd encounter progressively more soldiers and like vehicles dug into fighting positions, and then there was a point past which they'd be like, yeah, if you go into that field, like you're going to get killed by a sniper, basically. You're going to get shot at and probably killed. And so you just feel like, oh, I guess I can't go there.
Yeah.
But I wasn't this time. I wasn't. It was much more, I think, like, being in, I don't know, being in Madrid circa 1937 or something. It's sort of like, is somebody trying to assassinate me? Is somebody going to try to kidnap me or something? Like, we had a buddy team rule. You would only go in buddy teams. But I think for the most part, we were pretty safe.
It's just, to me, I have not had that experience. I haven't been anywhere that would be considered like a war zone or even a sort of unstable civilian environment since leaving the military. So I don't have any experience for it. And obviously, like, watching this happen, I've had a lot of thoughts of sort of like, what would I do? And, I'm 37. I, still have some orthopedic injuries from when I was in the military. To me, I'm just sort of like, I don't think I would be of any assistance as a fighter. If I was a Ukrainian, I would probably try to get away from the fighting unless, it was me that was threatened. And then, well, who knows what I would do. And it's weird to be like, here's this is lots and lots of people just like us are having to go through that thought process in real life. And above all that, outside of the actual conflict and the sort of what's on the ground, sort of realities of combat, has been this huge rhetorical debate about the invasion and what Ukraine represents, what Russia represents. And Francis and I, we took the position from the very beginning, before the war even broke out, that we opposed any conflict on the grounds that the overwhelming majority of people who were going to die if there was a war would be civilians and conscripts. And so, regardless of what you thought the ideological underpinnings of either side were, it's bad if it happens. And now we're in a situation where, personally, as someone with no connection to Ukraine, no family in Ukraine, who hasn't been to Ukraine ever. My argument is, regardless of what things you might dislike about the composition of the Ukrainian armed forces or Ukraine's politics, the big problem is that Russia invaded its neighbor. It invaded a sovereign country. It committed an illegal war of aggression, and it's now seems to, you can't say a conviction's been handed down, but all of the evidence suggests they are systematically committing war crimes and executing people. So it's really hard to look at this and say, well, I think it's ambiguous, because it's not really at this point. That's my take on it. And I'm wondering, like, your perspective on that larger debate, but also in the context of, this is something you've been talking about, you've been writing about, you've been warning people about, basically your worst case scenario, your worst nightmare for this country happened. And I'm wondering, like, what that feels like and what's been going through your head. So please, if you wouldn't mind, I'd love to hear your thoughts on sort of the sort of rhetorical debate behind the conflict, but also like how it's felt personally for you.
Yeah, and I appreciate the question and the acknowledgement of my obsession with Ukraine over the past few years. I guess the first thing, the first weird thing to admit is that the last thing that I wrote in late November of last year about, like, I think this is going to happen. Basically, I wrote an essay for the Daily Beast that said, I think this is going to happen. And I haven't really been able to write since. So this whole thing has just been, apart from, Twitter, which isn't writing. Twitter is like, feeling in 28 characters, 280 characters. I've dreaded this happening, and it's dreadful, and it's as bad as it is, it's going to get worse. Like, somehow it's going to get even worse. And I feel myself, like, I like to be able to see multiple sides of a debate and kind of get into the idea of, like, what is correct and what is incorrect. Like, I came to leftism over a long time. I didn't just, like, one day I wasn't like, oh, I've decided to be like this. Like, it took a long time of looking at what America does in the world, what America does at home, what the West stands for, what the West says it stands for. And now, like, the thing has happened and I just can't write, which means I can't think about it. And I think and I tweet and I talk in very monochromatic ways, which is to say Ukraine is good, or Ukraine is not the bad one here, and Russia is the bad one here. And the more you think that way, the more I feel like that's fascism. Like, fascism is like locking into a militaristic way of seeing the world. And I feel myself getting drawn into that direction. I hate it. Having said that, the big, I think it's important now to say that whatever Russia was or may have turned into, or, whatever the why behind Russia's actions, they are at this moment an aggressively imperialistic country. They're the worst thing a country can be, as far as I'm concerned. And if once that gets acknowledged, you get to see why Ukraine has done all the weird stuff that it has over the years. I mean, I think about fascism, and then you've got, I feel this pull to just say, fuck Russia, but whatever they've got, whatever comes Russia's way, they've got coming to them, which is a terrible thing to think. It's an immoral way to think. And then you understand, I think I understand pretty, effectively how Ukraine could tolerate, a group like Azov, for example, who are Nazis. I first encountered Azov in 2015. And it took me a little while to orient myself, because it might take a little while. It might not be natural for people post 2016 to think, like, oh, Nazis, yeah, they're real, they exist, we know those guys, like they're around. Like in 2014, 2015, it wasn't like there were a ton of Nazis doing Nazi shit. That was like,
yeah, I mean, there's stuff in America, sort of vestigial Klan kind of things and sort of weird offshoots of that. But the idea of, like, an organized movement that espouses Nazi ideology, and it's not just like a fringe thing of weirdos. Like, it's an actual movement. Like, we have better examples of stuff that's proximate to that in America now, right, in terms of what's happened post 2016. But before then, you would think about, like, some sad gathering of freaks, doing a parade of 15 people in, like, a small town in Indiana. And I'm not dissing Indiana. It seems to happen in Indiana a lot.
I wonder why that is.
Yeah, I wonder why.
No, that's exactly right. It's just, and so 2015, when I first met them, I was like, this is weird. Like, I don't really understand this. This is like, I don't know, maybe this is like US special operations, or there's lots of people who have weird tattoos. And I mean, but then you talk to them for a little while and they're like, no, we're Nazis. Like, that's what we believe. And you're like, I guess these guys are Nazis. And why are they permitted? Why does Ukraine put up with them? They put up with them because Ukraine didn't have much of a military in 2014. They had a military on paper, but of the 40 or 60 or 100,000 troops they had on paper, they had 3 brigades: the 95th, the 91st, and the 25th. So they had about 7,000 trained soldiers. And when you don't have a military and your country gets invaded, what you do is you open up the barracks and the armories, and you hand out weapons, and you say anybody who wants to defend the country can do that. So Ukraine lost total control over their authority over violence back in 2014. And one of the groups, the groups that are best organized to do violence, like if you snap your fingers, are extremists. Like that would be the same case here in the US. If like the military wasn't here and we got invaded and somebody like went around with a megaphone saying, everybody, pick up your weapons, the people who would respond first and with the most weapons would be extremists, mostly on the far right, like 99% on the far right. And so that's Azov.
One of the points that I kind of made out is, I fully understand and recognize that Azov are Nazis. It's not great. But, if your neighborhood is being shelled and somebody rolls up in a pickup truck and says, get your family, get your shit, throw it in, and let's go. I got a safe house to get to. Are you suddenly doing, well, what are your politics first?
But I mean, all of us have had that happen to us in our lives, though, in the military. I mean, think about the times, I'm not saying explicitly Nazi, but think about how many times someone you didn't really know you were deployed with, maybe you were in a firefight with, maybe you were in a convoy that took contact, maybe you got blown up together, maybe you just did an operation, you were stressed out together, like you worked with these people, you knew of them as their sort of military selves, you knew of them as competent or people you could work with, like you knew what you'd get from them. And then after deployment, you hang out with them and you realize like they are so ideologically different from you and there's no way to reconcile that. Like that's happened to me so many times. Like I can only imagine in a situation far more dire. And that's not an excuse. But I make this argument, Adrian, and I'm interested in your take on it because I've seen something I've seen you say it and I respect your opinions. And I've seen other people who I think are more, they found a line that they think is useful and they're repeating it, which is to say, well, Ukraine's far right has a far smaller representation in its politics, in its parliamentary politics than other European countries. And I would make the argument, because I've seen this done, for example, British people saying this, that like, well, the Tories get 40% in a general election, but Ukraine's far right only gets 2%. And the first argument I would make is, I feel as though you are in an interesting ideological cul-de-sac if you think that Azov and the Conservative and Unionist Party of Great Britain and Northern Ireland are the same. That doesn't bode well for Britain if they are the same, but I feel as though that is a bit of a sleight of hand. But the second point that I would make, and this is the one that I'm really interested in your take, is I've tried to keep an open mind about stuff from people who were what you might describe as anti-Ukrainian nationalists, but as time has gone on, some of those people just reacted with horror and oftentimes have reacted to, violence and war crimes on either side. But some of them are just full on like Putinist. Like there's nothing you can do about that. And at a certain point when you realize that these people are just never going to do anything but that, like there's not really any point unless you're like, you're doing intelligence gathering, which I'm not. I have a finite amount of time to read things. But the argument that I would make, and I'm interested in your take on this, is that I have seen things obviously translated into English that would seem to imply that like the kind of impetus behind things like Right Sector and Azov is not just represented as militia groups. It's also right-wing nationalist groups that do everything from like alms for veterans or vocational training or like martial arts training, MMA training, things like that. They are represented by a group that aims to touch people, in communities to recruit, to build, to kind of like spread an ideology. And I would make this argument, and I realize that it's a fraught argument to make, so I feel free to react badly if you do. But being from the only state in America that was openly run by the Klan, the argument that I would make is that like Indiana had the Klan as represented. The governor was endorsed by the Klan. The state assembly was endorsed by the Klan. The Klan put out a platform, like a slate of who they said should run. Like they were openly Klan candidates. But that doesn't mean that Indiana was the most Klan-dominated state in America. It's just that in the Deep South, they didn't have to be, because everyone was either ideologically sympathetic to the Klan, in the Klan, or they knew to not ever say anything against them because they were completely cowed by them. And my argument is that, like, when a far-right movement like that exists, it doesn't really need parliamentary representation if it's got a presence in people's lives. And the final thing that I would say, because I'm not trying to disparage Ukraine so much as try to, like, hopefully shed a little bit of light. The other point that I would make is that if you are concerned about this, which I think people are right to be, the biggest driver of far-right recruitment I can possibly fucking imagine is the far-right people, A, all being right about the threat, and B, your country being invaded by the thing the far-right warned you about.
Yeah.
That's the thing, is that, like, the problem here is that it's not just that there are Nazis in Ukraine, which we agree there are, and that they may not just be in parliamentary politics. It's that Russia has invaded Ukraine, and as such, there is now a threat to life of everyone in that country that's going to drive extremism significantly.
Yeah, no, that's exactly right. I take your points, and I think Azov to me is indefensible because of their beliefs. It's worthwhile to understand how Azov came to be, and I think it's important to have clear eyes about that. Azov came to be, again, in a total vacuum of governmental authority over violence. Like, the one thing a government is supposed to do, if it does anything, is secure the country. Like, it obviously our government doesn't do much in that department. It does too much of that. But if you do one thing, it's the country doesn't fall apart because it gets invaded. Like, that's the most basic service that even the libertarians will agree about.
And there is someone who's allowed to use force and other people who are not. That's sort of the basic kind of hierarchy involved here.
Right. And so, firstly, Azov was permitted to get violence because they were extremists, they were well organized, they were able to step into that authority vacuum, that authority over violence. But even worse, two things even worse. Firstly, they went to Mariupol and liberated Mariupol back in 2014, or participated in the liberation of Mariupol. It wasn't the only group. Back then, there were a few hundred dudes in Azov, but they took that sort of legend, the legend of Azov, and they boosted themselves, and they used it for recruiting, and they set up their headquarters in Mariupol. And now what we're seeing is they're going down in history now. Like, Azov is going to be written about 50 or 100 years from now, which was always their goal. Their goal was to be the hero, to play the hero. And to my thinking, that all starts from the fact that they showed up. They showed up to do the thing. And Ukraine is isolated. There aren't NATO units in Ukraine. The only American units that were in Ukraine were training units. They've been withdrawn. And so, when the only people who show up, like, to your original point about, you're in a house, something bad is happening, the people who show up on your side are Nazis, and it's you get shot in the head, or you thank a Nazi for helping you. Like, you have that's a tough river to cross in that moment, in that instant. And most Ukrainians are looking at what they're doing and saying, well, these guys are heroes. And who set the context for that? Who created the conditions for that? That was Russia. Russia were the ones who invaded. Russia's the ones who have helped isolate Ukraine systematically over the years. So one of the things that, I was happy to have done in the West, especially, was to show up and say, no, America's here too. And, no, this is the way we do things is different, and I'm not saying like the way America does things. American citizens, because we're the best part of America. The worst part of America is the American government, which is, optimistically speaking, incompetent, and pessimistically speaking, perhaps less evil than Russia, but in that same area.
Yeah, but not by as enormous a margin as a lot of Americans would like to comfort themselves in terms of, and I didn't mean to interrupt you, but I agree with that point. I feel like you can discuss the facts of things and be straightforward without minimizing or downplaying it. And I'm not saying you are, but I feel as though the accusation of being, accommodating Nazis and stuff like that gets bandied around quite a bit. And I guess my take is just more like, nah, man, I wish they weren't there. But like nothing I say or do in Twitter or in my daily life in the United Kingdom is going to take away from the fact that like they are there and they are doing stuff. And quite frankly, they are fighting an invasion which is massively, vehemently unpopular among Ukrainians. And as such, like if you are giving arms to Ukraine and you support the idea of let's arm Ukraine to fight off Russia, you are giving arms to these people. And like
definitely,
doesn't fucking fill me with joy to envision an organized neo-Nazi group having javelins and Stinger missiles and the heavier side of small arms and potentially like light armored vehicles. But like that is what's going to happen, and you're not being pro-Putin by acknowledging that, but also like you do have to at least ask yourself the question, like if you oppose giving arms to Ukraine in general because of that threat, you do realize Ukrainians aren't going to give up. But that's pretty clear they're not going to give up. So whether it's with fucking Mosin Nagants or Lee Enfield rifles, they're going to fight. How effective they're going to be, probably not that effective, but they're not going to quit. And I don't know. I've seen the argument made that, like, from a socialist perspective, you should say, well, no state is worth dying for. It's like, great, but you know what? Ukrainians are going to fight. Like, you can say that from where you're at, but like, that doesn't mean that's going to resonate with those people at all. Chances are good that they're just going to say, fuck you.
And Americans also don't really understand that, like, America is very much a melting pot. But when you talk, and correct me if I'm wrong, Adrian, please, but like it's not necessarily I fight for Ukraine. It's I fight because I am a Ukrainian. It is more kind of a cultural thing. Like they're not dying for their state. They're dying because fuck you, Russia. I'm Ukrainian, and you're not gonna take.
And
this.
It feels like in some cases they're fighting because literally their village was invaded. Like they're fighting because they ran off to the woods from where they live, and they are fighting the Russians where they used to live.
And also, like, what is the other option? Okay, it's not worth fighting for the state and dying. Cool, you're just going to get gunned down in the street. So, I hate to be the dying on your feet versus dying on your knees, but I mean, for a lot of people, that really is what it comes.
But also,
down
like,
to.
And I'm going to hand it back to Adrian. I promise. I also feel as though like the ideological stakes have been raised post all these revelations about places like Bucha, in the sense that Busha, in the sense that you're now looking at a situation in which it certainly seems like a lot of people are being arbitrarily killed. So the argument of like, no, just like live peaceably, no bloodshed whatsoever, like that kind of loses traction when it does seem as though your reward for not fighting is being killed.
Bucha was a huge eye-opener for me personally, because I really thought it was more of the like, they're not going to take my city, they're not going to take my home, and taking the home is something that's meaningful to a lot of Ukrainians. But I really thought it was like operating more on that level. Like, no, like we have a country, we're going to fight for our country. And after Bucha, I was like, oh, I think I was wrong. Like, no, for these people, it's actually like, it's this, or it's get gunned down with a gun in my hand, or get gunned down with a bullet in the back of my head and my hands tied behind my back. Like that's, it's one or the other. And I think that's important to acknowledge.
It is very easy for anybody who is sitting on a phone or a computer in America, and regardless of what level of safety you're at here, you're not getting shelled. And like you've got to understand that like everything that's happening over there is an experience that like even we don't really have. Like my war was Afghanistan and Iraq. I had a fucking Subway in Iraq. We had a Burger King trailer in Afghanistan. And yes, I know the forward operating bases didn't have those things, but like a lot of the COBs and the FOBs and the PRTs that I went to had hot water, had hot chow, had places, it had, at least decent places. You weren't using a slit trench latrine. It's not the same.
You could make the argument that aside from people who were living in Hawaii in World War II, that the last time Americans felt the kind of threat that people are under in Ukraine was either the Civil War or potentially even as far back as the War of 1812.
Yeah.
Like, we don't have the perspective for it. And that's not to excuse stuff. It's just to say that like people love to say, I wouldn't do that, but like you aren't going to be made to do that either.
Yeah, it's there. There's going to be a lot of, and I hope nobody ever has to experience it. This isn't I hope somebody, I hope a Russian comes down your street in, I don't know, San Francisco and puts a gun to your head. But like, there is like, and this is why like I have a lot of sympathy for everybody involved in this, because like, my experiences with war is basically a bunch of assholes decide that they don't like those other assholes. And so they're going to send a bunch of people to go and do asshole stuff. And then a bunch of other assholes are going to get rich off of it. And like, that is just the background of pretty much any war you have in any country. And it's just, as we said earlier, we're against it because, number one, because the people who are going to suffer the most are civilians or conscripts or people who don't generally want to be there. And, like, you can make whatever argument you want about, they should just leave, they should desert, they should do this, they should do that, nobody should die for a state, things like that. But man, like it's just like it's an unimaginable scenario for me. And like to say that, well, here's what I would do in this situation. Like, I don't know if what I would do is pick up a gun and, go defend my country or crawl underneath my desk and cry until somebody shoots me. I don't fucking know. Like it's impossible for anybody to really say, because it is just it's an experience that, you're not going to have here in America, at least not right now. You're not.
And yeah, to echo that, I mean, like God or the universe or luck defend us from that happening. Like ever, what's going on over there is just insane. It's so weird for me to see the political images, like people like Poroshenko was in Kharkiv in like body armor, carrying around a rifle. Zelensky's doing his thing. I mean, politicians that are like Trump and Biden in terms of, or like Trump and Clinton, even like in terms of how much they loathe each other personally, or sort of like cooperating. And this is the real challenge of war to socialism, I think, to solidarity. And one of the attractions of war to fascists, because war is the space where that can happen. If you're not fighting because very few people actually fight for a state, people fight for each other. And people fight for themselves. And so if you're fighting for yourself and you're fighting for each other, it's sort of like you're part of the community, you're part of the team. And one of the things that I really wanted to help shape in my time over there, in my limited time over there, was the conditions under which that solidarity could exist not in wartime. Making connections with people who weren't fighting because they wanted to get their gun on, people who were only doing that as a means to an end, the end being, not experiencing ethnic cleansing. And that's been a challenge for the last 150 or 200 years. That's like, how does a country come together in war, but not just sort of stay there in that fascistic state and, glamorize violence and, remember the heroes? How do you make that transition from, hey, remember we all did that thing together? What if instead of that thing being like beating the shit out of whatever country invaded us and, I don't know, like advocating for healthcare or something like that? And that might sound simplistic, but it's really powerful. That solidarity is incredible. And it's such a fucking shame that it only exists in war. And like in our countries, Nate, you're in Britain, one of the original countries to crack the code on this. Me and Francis are in America. We take it a step further and profit over that. Like that's most of our business model right now, profiting off of that.
I noticed what felt like a lot of people who had fought in Iraq looking at the war in Ukraine and feeling somewhat circumspect, this being Americans who fought in Iraq, because I would presume, without trying to put words in their mouths, that it might at least explicate, if you will, the extent to which the Americans invading Iraq generated solidarity amongst Iraqis who might not have supported the regime at all, but there was a foreign invader in their country. And I feel like, without trying to put those people, in the spotlight and embarrass them for takes I disagree with, I think it's just more like it's to most people, to many people, that would be, pretty obvious. And I think the reaction from Ukrainians, it makes sense why they have reacted the way they've acted. And
you guys will really appreciate this. So after this, so we got some coverage from Rolling Stone and CNN, me, Matt, and Ben. And afterwards, a bunch of people reached out to us and were like, hey, we want to help continue this training. About 75% of them were contractors who were looking to sign contracts with the Ukrainian government. And one group, I was talking with this group and I was like, yeah, we didn't get any money. Like, there was no contract here. We just did it. Like, no, there's like, this is a volunteer thing. And he got angry. He was like, well, Ukraine's going to have to fucking start signing contracts. Okay. Like, they need our expertise. And I was like,
Christ.
that's just it there. You know, that's it, man. Right there. It's like, they're going to fucking need to, okay? They need to get their heads out of their asses. I'm like,
they need to bring KBR over to run the
exactly.
defects.
We need Fluor to figure out a banging recipe to make borscht and shi for people. Listen, Adrian, I know you have to run relatively soon, and so in the last couple of minutes that we have together, I wanted to talk about, call it the elephant in the room, which is a bit of a dark humor. I mean, we're all veterans. We've all experienced, combat. There is an extent to which I've watched, people who are ideologically aligned more or less with the same train of thought as, Alexander Dugin and Vladimir Putin, and ideologues on the right across the world who basically said, Putin is strong and has a strong country because he doesn't tolerate gender or some dumb bullshit like that. The really stupid, really online take was sort of like, Putin is going to, the T-90 is going to destroy your they-them army. We then discovered they'd never put gas or oil or fucking grease in the T-90. What I'm trying to say about the elephant in the room is it's horrible, and I hope you don't get mad at me for saying this, but amidst all of the horror and misery and just utter devastation that we're seeing, can we at least reflect on the fact that Russia not ever doing PMCS is very, very funny?
That is so fucking funny, man.
That's like hilarious. It's so funny. I'm losing my mind at it. I'm just like, gee, what the fuck? Did you literally sell off all of your fucking diesel in Belarus? Did you really run out of gas like 10 miles from the border? How the fuck does this happen?
You know how this happens? You know how this happens? You don't have a strong NCO corps. You don't have some sergeant. You don't have a sergeant who's grabbing everybody by the ears and dragging them out there and say, go do your fucking weeklies and make sure the tracks aren't going to fall off in case I got to go invade someplace.
Actually, I would say the problem is that you need the yin and yang of honest maintenance NCOs and shady supply NCOs to make a military work. And Russia has all tons and tons of the latter and none of the former.
Yeah. There's another part of that, which is kind of like, and I haven't said too much of this on Twitter because I'm afraid that if I do, like, people start to figure out like Ukraine will lose support. I mean, if Ukraine pulls this off, then like, I don't know, 60 to 70% of people employed by think tanks in the defense industry should lose their jobs. They should be out of a job. If Ukraine pulls off one of the great military upsets of all time with a largely dismounted force, rocking Soviet-era weapon systems and fucking javelins and stingers, like, fuck you and your $800 million budget. Fuck you and your $1 trillion budget. Fuck you and your fucking unnecessary ass, like, boats. Like, no, stop. Like, give us fucking healthcare. I
gotta say, I'm very upset that like Russia has been touted as our greatest enemy and this huge superpower, and then just to watch them like lose in such a spectacular fashion, and to have nothing but build up time too. Like, you had so much time and you still managed to step on your dicks. In fact, you didn't step on your dicks. You rolled over them with the tank, and then the tank ran out of gas, and now you're stuck there by your dick in Ukraine.
and I mean, obviously, like, we don't know what's going to happen in the East. We don't know what's going to happen if they're going to be able to roll them back all the way. Like, there's a lot of stuff up. I mean, Ukraine has lost a lot of troops, a lot of material. Like, it's a fluid situation. That's my sort of like my think tankies, if you will. But like, I am amazed that this has happened. Also, something I'd point out, Adrian, I'm curious in your last couple of minutes. One of the things that really kind of surprised me was seeing the clarion calls for a no-fly zone. Obviously, given that would precipitate NATO in conflict with Russia, but also like my impression was that the Russians don't have air superiority throughout the country. Like, they haven't been able to dominate the airspace.
This is the craziest thing of all. And yeah, I don't want to run too far over. I got to pick up my son. I got another like 5 to 10 minutes. Is, and there were signs of this. There were signs of this back in 2014 that Russia's military was like existed largely on paper. And you remember when I said earlier, 2014, Ukraine's military existed mostly on paper.
Yeah.
It was so fucking corrupt. They had, out of 800 tanks, they had 12 that were operational, and those are the 12 they used for parades when Russia went into Crimea. Like, they just didn't have a military for the most part. They had a few brigades, and the rest of it was junk. And they had to kind of cannibalize stuff. And, they learned their lessons, but it was hard lessons, very hard lessons. And Russia, I think maybe they have a much bigger military than Ukraine did back in 2014, but maybe their military is like the military of 2014. You get these people who keep, they have these dire predictions that like, oh, the real Russian military is going to show up, like fucking like from the Nazi moon base, like the real Russian military is what you see today. There's no hidden military in reserve. That's it. There's no Far Eastern military. It's just what you see. The reason there aren't more air sorties by the Russian military is that if you think it's tough to like circulate fucking like do tire rotations on an ADA platform, think about how difficult it must be to train or maintain a 5th generation fighter. They got like 1,000 of those on the books. How many of those can fly? Well, probably the 50 to 100 we see flying today. You know what I mean? Like, I think there just isn't that much there. They're super corrupt. But I really hope that Ukraine is able to hang on, both for Ukraine, but also for what that means for the West. I think that if Ukraine is able to win with grit and 550 cord and duct tape and javelins and shit, like with dismounts, then again, it's just sort of like we don't that fancy new laser thing that we don't need that. You can fucking endline that shit. We don't need it.
And I'm not going to pretend that I'm not grossed out by what you might call the sort of like Raytheon Acres cheerleaders in this conflict, because I think that like it's very different when the people who are out firing those javelins are facing death and their families are facing death. Like, to me, it's just like cheering on bloodshed, and I really don't like it. Like, I wouldn't be espousing the politics that I have on the show and have had for the whole time we've been doing it if I was like, oh, well, this time, because it's a much more clear moral argument, like, I'm really into fucking blood and guts now. Like, it's horrifying.
Yeah.
But I obviously would prefer, I want Russia to lose, because what they did is abhorrent and just nakedly imperialist. But also, I am amazed at how wrong so many people were. And I didn't go on record. I'm not obligated to go on record. I didn't go on record saying I think this will or will not happen. I was shocked when it did happen, because it just, in the same way that, embarrassingly, when I was 18 years old, I was shocked the U.S. invaded Iraq. I didn't think we were going to. I thought it was a bluff. And I thought this was a bluff. And then it happened. And when I saw the first reports that they had repelled the airfield seizure at Hostomel, and I was like, what the fuck is going on? And then I was just like, within a couple of days, it's just like, wait, is this genuinely, like, is it really that bad? Like, do they really not have gas, not have POL, not have munitions, not have unexpired rations? Are they literally all like, is this true? Are these rumors true? Like, am I repeating rumint, or is it actually genuinely true that these guys were told they were on exercise on the border and they didn't know they were invading until they'd crossed the border? Like, that sucks for those fucking privates, but what? Like,
yeah.
What?
And there are people whose job it is, who get paid directly or indirectly by defense contractors, whose job it is to tell us and to tell Congress, and they're 95% of the people who are doing this telling, because there's no money in saying the opposite. To tell us we need these things, because if we don't get them, Russia's going to invade us. They're going to roll through Alaska. They're going to cut through our defenses like a hot knife through butter. And I don't think that's going to happen.
I mean, honestly, if they just attacked us with butter, that would probably be more effective than what they're fucking doing now, apparently. Like, because that would at least jam up our stuff. The Navy boats that break if they get wet also really can't handle dairy. But like, right. Adrian, I know you got to run in a second. I appreciate your perspective on this, and I appreciate the fact that like you may have maintained your convictions and your politics about this, in the sense we don't always agree. In fact, when you were on the show, we didn't agree a lot, but I think that like I appreciate the fact that even in the face of this, you're sort of still interpreting it that way, and I would obviously like, here's the thing, man, right? Like, no offense, like, I don't think this of you, but if you had turned around and you were like full on, like, I'm Mr. NATO and I want the US to invade Ukraine, like you invade Russia now, like, given your personal connection to it, like, I'd get it. I'd be disappointed, but I'd get it. You know what I mean? So I really respect the fact that you still look at this and you say like, no, like, this is fucked, but like, here's the situation as it exists. Here's the world we are living in, not the world we would idealize. If that makes sense.
I appreciate that. I've felt, to be clear with people, like emotionally, that would be, very satisfying. Like in like that's, I feel like I want that to happen, but that's the same part of me that like gets jazzed up watching the end of the first Star Wars, or like watching, a Star Trek movie where like the bad guys get fucking pounded. That's not real. The real truth is, any escalation would, dramatically, I think any escalation would probably pretty quickly lead to World War III. So you just can't. It's irresponsible to say that. It's irresponsible to call for that. But I appreciate you saying that.
Well, no, man. I mean, let's be honest. When I was a second lieutenant, they sent me to every course they could because they didn't have any fucking thing for me to do because I was the only second lieutenant, like basically in the battalion. So I got the TOW 2 Bravo course. I got the Javelin course. I know how to use a clue. Part of me is like, wait, should I do this for like a second? And then I remind myself, I'm like, I'm married, I'm 37, and my tummy hurts. So, I don't speak Ukrainian, I don't speak Russian. I have never used the weapon systems that the Ukrainian military uses. So like, no, actually, probably not.
But at least we know, with our experience with Adrian, that you can podcast from Ukraine. So
you can.
Yes.
Yeah, I can tactically podcast. Listen, Adrian, thank you so much for making time for this. Thank you so much for your insight here. This has been really great, and I hope that our listeners, even if they disagree with you and us, like they keep an open mind about this, because I feel like you were there, you've got a personal connection to it, you've been there a bunch, and this is a fucked situation. But like, I would rather hear from people who can at least talk about it with clear eyes versus people who are just sort of like, no, my fanfic reigns supreme.
Right. It's a pleasure to be back. And always enjoy podcasting with you.
All right, Adrian, thanks so much. And once this is all over, maybe we'll bring you back on to kind of give us a Ukrainian AAR. I'm sure somebody's going to need one. Everybody, thank you for listening, and we'll talk to you next week.
Yeah, take care.